I have been interested in historic trauma or generational grief for over 40 years. First introduced to the concept by Grandma Flemo in Babb, Montana, where I grew up, essentially where I grew up, and reintroduced by Grandma Grounds, who was the matriarch of the Blackfeet tribe at the time. Became very close friends with them, and they instructed me where to look, what to look for, what to think about. So what I'm going to do today is give you a very, very condensed version of historic trauma. As I told Tom, it's condensed down from about 3,000 or so pages that I have. Notebooks that are filled. I narrowed this talk down to this many pages with this many markers, and then I reassessed the markers until I got it down to what I thought was a manageable size. At 4:30 or 4 o'clock this morning, I realized that it was way too complicated. So I have condensed it to what you're going to see and a series of thank you 3M sticky notes. So historic trauma. This is essentially going from 1492 until the present. What did Queen Isabella, who was the Queen of Spain when Columbus sailed in 1492, what did she and historical trauma have in common other than Columbus?
Reuniting Spain and removing the Muslim Jews.
Actually, it's much less complex than that. Queen Isabella suffered from swine flu and recovered. Columbus brought swine flu to the New World. And you'll see why that's important shortly. My objective for you is for you to understand the concept of historical trauma or generational grief, to have an appreciation for the historical perspective surrounding historical trauma, have an appreciation for the effects historical trauma has on Indigenous people as members of a larger community, and then in the end, you have a little bit of knowledge. What are you going to do with that? With generational grief or historical trauma, you have to have a definition. The first one comes from Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Greatheart, who is my mentor. I've had multiple conversations with her. She defines it as the collective emotional and psychological injury, both over the lifespan and across generations, resulting from cataclysmic history of genocide or ethnocide. The Aboriginal Healing Foundation, which is an organization in Canada and very, very active in working with people who are seriously damaged by historical trauma. They call historical trauma and intergenerational grief is best described as psychological baggage being passed from parents to children, along with the trauma and grief experienced in each individual's lifetime. Unresolved historic trauma will continue to impact individuals, families, and communities until the trauma has been addressed mentally, emotionally, physically, and spiritually. And to kind of further explain this, what we see as normal when we are children, we pass on to our children, those physical, mental, spiritual properties. What we're talking about with historical trauma is everything from 1492 to now that is continually passed on generation after generation. I have broken this down into 6 phases. The first 3 phases, first contact, economic competition, and the invasion war period, all kind of overlap. Subjugation and reservation period are kind of starting in the 1870s, although it overlaps invasion, obviously. If we get in the boarding school period, that's 1880 to really to the present. The last real boarding school disappeared in 2007, but there are still boarding schools in the sense that kids are boarded there, they're just not removed and put there.
More choice.
Yeah. And then you have forced relocation and termination period. First contact, 1492 to the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890. Now, how do you say that that's first contact? We're going over 400 years. 1492 we all know about. The Wounded Knee Massacre was the last massacre to occur. And it's incredibly significant in the history of Indian or indigenous people's relationship to particularly the government. Wounded Knee Massacre occurred in South Dakota, 1890. A group of Lakota Sioux were gathered in a group after being told that the ghost dance was forbidden. The ghost dance started in Arizona about 1860, 1870, and moved up into this area in 1889 to 91. The ghost dance was an attempt by, starting with the Paiutes and moving up into the Dakotas, the Plains, an attempt to reunify the native peoples. They would dance for 5 days. It was a structured dance. They didn't eat, they didn't drink. I mean, it was an incredible experience, and what it was going to do was bring back the dead, bring back the buffalo, bring back their life. The other thing is, with the ghost dance, you got a shirt that would protect you from bullets. That the government didn't like. Didn't like the idea that they were becoming united. They didn't like the idea that they were ghost dancing. Wounded Knee Massacre occurred when they gathered a group of Lakota, moved them to Wounded Knee, and the day after they put them down by the creek, they were surrounded by cavalry who had Hotchkiss guns, which were essentially a form of machine gun. And argument, 200 to 300 people, natives, were killed. 90% of whom were women and children. Very few warriors. The disgusting part for me is that out of that massacre, 24 soldiers were given the Congressional Medal of Honor for a very dishonorable act. The nice thing is, not too long after that, they were taken away. First contact, I mentioned swine flu. That was one disease. Add to that smallpox. Add to that measles. Add to that diphtheria, dysentery, typhoid. Add to that slavery. Add to that outright slaughter and massacre of masses of people. When Columbus landed in 1492, there were between 8 and 10 million people in what we refer to as the Hispaniola area, which would be Dominican Republic, Haiti, and the surrounding islands. 8 to 10 million. 1492. By 1550, there were 28,000. 28,000. That's genocide. That's ethnocide. That's eliminating a race. During this time, there was no time for grief. During these epidemics, these epidemics went on and on and on until, well, the last epidemic was 1918. And they occurred in these populations every 7 to 11 or 14 years, over and over and over again. "60 to 90% of our indigenous population died by 1918. The bubonic plague. 1333 was the first occurrence of the bubonic plague. Lasted off and on until 1720. Killed 50% of the population in Europe. And that's pretty well documented. The difference here is that there was more control over the populations in Europe. And there was a longer time between epidemics. So you had generations that were not affected, and then and populations came back, and then another plague would come and wipe out a substantial number of people. When you have epidemics, etc., that go on year after year after year, you do not have generations that recover. They just die off. Whole communities die. In the case of smallpox, smallpox disfigures you. So Jessica comes down with a case of smallpox. She has poxes all over her. That was not an acceptable state to be in among indigenous peoples. So what did you do? You left. And you took that disease with you to another place and spread the disease. There was no control. There was loss of so much because people just couldn't stay there and watch their families die off. And this is every 7 to 11 or 14 years. Decade and century after century. First contact brought alcohol. And we all know that. We all know the effects of alcohol. And we've heard the effects of alcohol on indigenous populations talked about numerous times. Just as bad was the introduction of sugar. The indigenous people did not have a tolerance for alcohol. The indigenous people did not have a tolerance for sugar. Where is our largest population of diabetics in our indigenous populations? It's rampant, thanks to first contact. So I'm kind of rambling too. The church, the Catholic Church in particular at that time, and I take this directly from a series of notes that I have on what the church said, the high mortality rates were seen as a gift from God for the chosen people. So I'm having to use these notes. 4:30 this morning. They were clearer in my head. Second came economic competition, sustenance loss. Natives had a great food source. They seldom went hungry. But with all of the physical loss of people, populations, the people who gathered that food were gone. How we gathered it, or how they gathered it, was gone. That information was not passed from generation to generation. Stewardship of the land. Our sense of stewardship and the indigenous population's sense of stewardship was very, very different. They did not own land. We thought they should. We raised crops. They didn't have to raise crops. They lived off the land. The buffalo is a classic example of losing subsistence. You all know the story. I'm not going to elaborate on it. But that was an example of incredible loss of sustenance. Colonial settlement brought alien social structure. It introduced non-traditional coping mechanisms and silenced knowledgeable subjects within the indigenous population, thereby damaging families, altering gender roles, authority, and diminishing cultural mores and values. Where women were essentially, they were the boss. Any way you wanted to look at it. Guys thought that they were, but they really weren't. The guys did what Mom said. Those roles were changed dramatically through physical and cultural loss and spiritual loss, loss of sustenance, and disease. extermination and the refugee syndrome. What I find incredibly interesting, Andrew Jackson was president at the beginning of the termination period. He was referred to as the Indian killer, as the sharp knife. He was essentially a genocidal maniac. And yet, he adopted 2 native children. He adopted one who was 14 months old, died a month later. Was in a massacre, led a massacre, found a child in a mother's arms who was still alive, adopted that young lady. She died at the age of 14 of tuberculosis. So the man responsible for the extermination, beginning of the extermination policy, was a president of the United States. He pushed it. That's what he wanted. It was his administration that brought about the Indian Removal Act and the Trail of Tears. Members of a number of tribes in the southeast, Florida, Georgia, etc., were removed to Oklahoma. Thousands died during that time. But they thought it would be better for them. Why would it be better for them? Because Southern gentlemen wanted their property, wanted the land that they were on. So it was easy just to gather them together and move them. The refugee syndrome, I just bring that up because it's a syndrome that's related to historical grief. A refugee is someone who, over time, can regain their sense of value. Refugee syndrome is very much like historical trauma. It is something that goes on generation after generation. And we're particularly actually the concept of refugee syndrome came with the Jews after World War II. And people started looking into the trauma that they were subjected to, and then started looking back historically to what had happened to the Jewish population. True refugees, that's what we ended up with during the termination period in particular. Subjugation and reservation period. Ulysses S. Grant, useless Grant, was the first president to establish a reservation, which essentially cut native populations from the land that they had lived in for centuries. They had to find new ways to survive. They were confined to a given space. These reservations isolated Native Americans to an area that was and is taken advantage of by the federal government administration, has been for years, and continues to be. The horror stories that come out of the administration of reservations. Grandma Flemmo told me about when they brought herds of cattle to the Blackfeet Reservation, and everybody was supposed to get a cow or two or three, and lo and behold, they disappeared. And there were 3 or 4 cattle left to feed the whole reservation. That happened time after time. Sacks of flour, 50-pound sacks of flour coming in on wagons. Enough to feed a population. Disappeared. This happened on every reservation. Time and time again. Therefore, you developed a forced dependency, or we forced a dependency as the oppressor. And this dependency continues now. It hasn't changed. And obviously, with a reservation being set up, there's a lack of security, a lack of feeling safe. This is what Mary Grounds said. The reservation marginalized us as people, and we became largely diminished and impoverished. As well, any perception of control we had over our lives became reduced and badly undermined, and ultimately placed the locus of control on the government. This is a woman who lived through this, who became the patriarch, or Grandma Grounds became the patriarch. Grandma Grounds became the matriarch of the Blackfeet tribe, a fabulous woman. A woman who came into my classrooms and talked to my kids. When we discussed evolution, I had a Catholic priest, a professor from Blackfeet Community College, and Mary Grounds. And the 3 of them came in and discussed from whence man came. You want to know something? All the stories were the same. The names were different. She was a marvelous, marvelous person, and I learned so much from her that it sickened me. That's why I get tied up in this. This is one of the most horrible times. 1880 to 2007, the boarding school period. Grandma Grounds, Grandma Flemmo both attended boarding schools. Mary Grounds said that when she was forcibly taken from her parents and moved to a school in Kansas, she did not see her family for 11 years. She entered the building, she was knocked to her knees and told to pray for her soul. She then had her hair, and her hair had never been cut because they just didn't do that. They braided their hair. The first thing they did was cut the braids off. She was beaten, she was sexually molested, she was abused, physically, other than just sexual abuse, knocked around. When I got to know her, she forgave me. Because I felt like it was my soul that had tarnished her. Destroyed families. Mary was a classic example. Didn't see her family for 11 years. They were beaten, they were sexually assaulted, they could not speak their native language. Mary did not speak English. There were several Blackfeet children there who spoke nothing but Blackfeet. Every time they uttered a word, a simple word like Oki. Oki means is like hello or how are you. They were beaten, severely beaten. They were put into literally solitary confinement for days at a time. There were no native religious practices, actually no native practices allowed at all. And what this ended up doing is giving us a generation of, several generations of children who were never parented. So they didn't know how to parent. They thought beating your kids was just the normal thing to do. Guys thought sexually abusing someone was just the way it was. So you ended up with an identity crisis, both on and off the reservation, particularly with these kids as they came back. Now the first boarding schools were just off the reservation. The first boarding school for the Blackfeet tribe actually was on the reservation just outside of Browning. They still call it boarding school. It's still there. Now they use it for a dormitory for kids that have nowhere else to go. But it's well monitored. They have learning experiences. It's not a school. It's not a boarding school. And kids were allowed to go home. So they'd go to school, spend the day, all this went on, and then they went home and they spoke their native language and had native rituals. Government decided that wasn't the way to do it. We've got to get them away. They can't have this opportunity. So let's put these boarding schools as far away from the reservation as we can. And they did. Short hair, it looks like a typical motel room. Religious studies, looking unto Jesus. Jesus did not abuse children. Here they're giving haircuts. It's like a typical classroom, except kids were beaten into submission. And that gives you an idea of how many children could be housed in a single school, abused in a single school. We come to forced relocation, the termination period. The government and the church, principally the Catholic Church, were largely successful in separating indigenous people from their culture, their language, their religion, their families, their communities, and the land. They were forced to move into urban areas. The 1954 Termination Act essentially was an act to terminate all reservations. The first reservation to be terminated was the Menominee Reservation in Wisconsin, which was a pretty poor area. No real wealth there. So the government decided, well, we'll just terminate this reservation. We'll buy it from the tribe for $14 million. We'll distribute that money among the people, and then they can go their own way. And we'll give this land out and sell it or whatever. The Menominee were relatively impoverished before termination. They became the most impoverished community in the United States within 4 years. The Termination Act was halted in 1960. But what they wanted to do was end the concept of Native Americans being sovereign nations. And that's a big fight in the state of Montana. And the Blackfeet are a classic example of considering themselves a sovereign nation, which according to the government, they are. Therefore, they have their own set of laws. And sometimes they refuse to obey the law of the land. But they are a sovereign nation. Termination tried to eliminate that. Termination Act and forced relocation prohibited religious freedom, the racism. Do you know that Montana is one of the most racist states in the United States? It's not because we have a large black population or a large Asian population. It's because we have a large Native American population, a large indigenous population. You know what city has the largest indigenous population? Anchorage. 7% of the people in Anchorage are Native. Do you know what's second? Billings, Montana. 5% of Billings' population is Native. Now, if you look where Billings is, you have a number of reservations located in that area. And it attracts people who are looking for jobs. It's time for us to admit that we are racist, that we are a racist state. And I bring this up, it makes people mad every time I do it. But I'm at the point at 71 years old, I don't care if you're mad. It's true. But I've stood in Walmart in Havre. I just stood back against the wall because there are a number of reservations in that area. And I've listened to what clerks have said to natives. I've listened to what they have said after the natives have gone by. They don't know that I'm listening. They talk to each other. And they're the most vicious racist comments. I see it in restaurants when I'm in Havre. If nothing else, and if you believe that we are an incredibly racist state, then it becomes incumbent upon us to not listen to jokes, about Native Americans, or ill-conceived comments. So here are three concepts about historical trauma. Historical trauma causes deep breakdowns in social functioning that may last for many years, decades, or generations. Clusters of symptoms may be passed to next generation in the form of socially learned behavior patterns. In this historical trauma response, the sense that you cannot grieve, that is the horror of it now. Among so many of our indigenous people, they feel they can't grieve. It's not right. No one hears it. Nobody's going to listen to their grief. We, as a dominant culture, act as if you do not have grief, or you do not have to grieve. I suffer from post-traumatic stress syndrome. I was lucky. I got treated. I was in Vietnam for 2.5 years as a combat medic. I came back. I went through hypnotherapy for 1.5 years. And am I cured? No, I'm not cured. You can't cure post-traumatic stress. But you can certainly get it under control to the point where you are functioning normally. Kind of normal, right? Historical trauma transmission. I put PTSD so that you have some way of thinking about what this is. For me, with post-traumatic stress disorder or syndrome, I had a beginning. I know when it and why it started, and it actually came to an end. There was an end point when I finished with treatment and I was able to function. I went to graduate school, etc., etc. Historical trauma is like post-traumatic stress, but it doesn't end, and it has not ended. Historical trauma transmission, abuse, spousal, child, sexual, addictions, alcohol, drugs, and gambling, depression, loss of parenting skills, learned helplessness, loss of a sense of family and interdependence, guilt, perceived external locus of control, suicidal, etc. This is from Grandma Brown's. I asked her why people don't talk about historical trauma. Her comment to me, direct quote, "It is probably too horrible to turn our gaze in that direction. It's too horrible to turn our gaze in that direction." Grandma Brown was a brilliant, brilliant woman. And yet she could not turn her gaze in that direction for many, many years. The following symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder or historical trauma and how they might affect indigenous populations. Chronic suicidal ideation, chronic suicide problems. The greatest suicide rate in the United States is among our indigenous people. Self-injury. I see this. I've worked on every reservation in Montana. I've done that for this is my 9th year. I see so much self-injury. Talk with kids about it. Explosive or extremely inhibited anger, and they can flip-flop. Compulsive or extremely inhibited sexuality can flip-flop. Amnesia for traumatic events. Kids will be involved in something that is traumatic, abuse of some sort, sexual abuse, physical abuse, mental abuse. You know it happened. It happened 4 days ago. You know where it happened. You know the circumstances surrounding it. And yet that child will not relate to it. You can give them the particulars and they say, I don't remember. Transient dissociative episodes. Reliving experiences. That's very common among post-traumatic stress survivors. A sense of helplessness or paralysis of initiative. Shame, guilt, and self-blame. Utter aloneness. I have talked to so many young children, so many high school kids, that they're surrounded by family, and yet they are alone. These are kids who are 15 and 16 years old. This is historic trauma. This is passed on generation to generation over 500 years. Unrealistic attribution of total power to the perpetrator. You can take that one any way you want. Isolation and withdrawal, persistent distrust, and a sense of hopelessness and despair. I would list myself with 90% of those. But I got help. I love this. And I wish I knew this man. John Firelater, I ask you to just close your eyes and listen. Before our white brothers arrived to make us civilized men, we didn't have any kind of prison. Because of this, we had no delinquents. Without a prison, there can be no delinquents. We had no locks nor keys, and therefore among us, there were no thieves. When someone was so poor that he couldn't afford a horse, a tent, or a blanket, he would, in that case, receive it all as a gift. We were too uncivilized to give great importance to private property. We didn't know any kind of money, and consequently, the value of a human being was not determined by his wealth. We had no written laws laid down, no lawyers, no politicians. Therefore, we were not able to cheat and swindle one another. We were really in bad shape before the white men arrived, and I don't know how to explain how we were able to manage without these fundamental things that, so they tell us, are so necessary for civilized society. The man stated it perfectly. And this is, when I do this presentation, it's normally 3 to 4 hours long. And when we're done, we'll get in small groups and talk about, okay, what did we learn? What can we do? And then you'll take those groups of 2 or 3 and put them into groups of 4 to 6, and they consolidate their feelings. And then you listen to them, and it's unreal what people come up with. And people that I've talked to who have really taken this to heart have changed the way they feel, the way they view our Indigenous population. This is the short version. I've never done the short version before. I don't know if I got my point across. Hopefully you understand my emotional take on this. It's so deep inside me for so long. And it's become such an incredible part of my life now that I've worked with on every reservation in Montana, working with high schools and grade schools. I think I'm starting at my age now, I'm beginning to understand. And I venture to guess that I've read more about it than any of you will ever read, because you don't have that much time. Any questions?